All right, so let's look at the Imperial Garden. And we focus on the Ming and the Qing dynasty because all the Imperial Garden are kind of from these two last imperial dynasties. Earlier ones had either been, reconstructed, reshaped, changed, and inherited by the later garden. So their design pretty much reflect the Ming and the Qing dynasty imperial garden design, and especially the last one, the last Qing dynasty. That is the nature of the garden because the garden they do change over time quite significantly. And the Qing dynasty conquered a vast land. So under the Qing Empire, so here we are looking at regions of different color. Those are kind of different cultural regions. This purple area is the what we might call China proper. This is the area where the Chinese speak Chinese. And that is the Manchurian area. This is the origin of for the rulers of the Qing dynasty. They were Manchus. They came from this area and they conquered China and so inherited Beijing as the imperial capital from the Ming dynasty. And from there, they conquered Mongolia and, Tibet also became a vassal state. And then the Muslim area, that is the Xinjiang province, where the Muslim Uyghur is the majority. And during the Qing dynasty, Korea and Southeast Asia, including Nepal as well, were also tributary states to the Qing court. So the Qing Empire is a vast empire whose territory is bigger than the current China. So the city of Beijing became the capital for the Qing dynasty. And so we are going to take a look at a few imperial gardens. One of them is the Yihoyen, and which is this one. That is usually called the Summer Palace. But in reality, there are more than one summer palaces, right? So this is the city of Beijing. This is the Forbidden City, where the emperor lived during the winter time. But in summer, the inside of the city wall is pretty hot and humid. So the emperors very often they live in those imperial gardens. There are 5 major ones in the northwestern suburb. And the Yihoyen is the one that survived the best. The rest of them, after the fall of the Qing dynasty, dilapidated, and no one took care of them. So they basically was returned to nature. And that one is the only one that has been preserved and thus became known as the Summer Palace. In fact, it was one of the many summer palaces for the Manchu rulers of the Qing dynasty. So we will look at that garden in some detail. That one called Yuanmingyuan is also known as the Old Summer Palace, right? So that one used to be the most important summer residence for the Manchu emperor, but it was destroyed during the Second Opium War. So today it was a ruined park, and that Yihoyen became better known as the Summer Palace, right? Those are not the only imperial gardens in the Beijing area. So just to the west of the Forbidden City, within the imperial city, is the so-called Western Park, the West Park, or the West Garden, and that is the garden, Imperial Garden, for the exclusively for the Imperial Palace, right? So that is the real backyard of the Forbidden City, right? So there we have the Forbidden City. And to the west is the immediate backyard, the garden, the Imperial Garden. That is the Imperial Garden within the city of Beijing. And then there are also many Imperial Gardens in the northwestern suburb of Beijing. So we will look at that, the so-called West Garden, just to the west of the Forbidden City. So this West Garden is known as the Three Seas. It refers to the three lakes. This is called the North Sea, or the North Lake. And this is the middle, or the Central Sea, or Central Lake. This is the Southern Lake, or, which is called the Southern Sea. So these are the three seas. And indeed, their size are real kind of a lake size, and they are big, much bigger than any of those private gardens we looked at. So they are called this is the North Sea, and it has an island in the middle. Again, like the private garden, it refers to the Taoist mythology about the immortal islands. And to give you a sense of the scale contrast between Imperial Garden and private garden, right? This is the size of a private garden. So all those Suzhou private garden we looked at before in the previous lecture, this is their size. And their lake are like that one, that tiny little blue dot there, right? And this is the Imperial Garden, and it is one of the three lakes in one of the Imperial Gardens, right? So that should give you a sense of the contrast of scale. And indeed, that garden was a copy of a private garden. So the Imperial Garden is a collection of gardens, right? It is a collection of gardens. It can fit hundreds of private gardens within its walled quarter. And its island is give you a sense of a real island. It's an actual full-size island. and it includes many courtyards. And in this case, each courtyard can fit in a private garden, right? So the North Sea Park has many courtyards, and some of them has a small garden like this one or that part. Some of them are religious architecture like this one. This is a Buddhist temple. So within these Imperial Garden, very often you find a full-size Buddhist or Taoist or Lama temple inside for the religious needs of the imperial family. And another courtyard served as a studio for the emperor. When the emperor stay here, that is his studio, and it is also his library. There is a collection of books in that courtyard. And then there are various courtyards for different function. And in the lake, there's another Buddhist temple, and in this case, that is a Tibetan Buddhist temple. And on the summit of that hill in the garden is a Tibetan style Buddhist pagoda. And to the south of that island is a small kind of peninsula, and there is a tiny little circular castle, and which served as another kind of a private collection of the emperor's antiques, and that one is also mostly Taoist in terms of its religious association. So there are the Imperial Garden often had kind of those full-size temples and shrines and smaller gardens within its enclosure. So here we are standing on this bridge and looking south at the island, and on top of the island is a Tibetan style pagoda, right? So there is a kind of a bridge called a 5 Pavilion Bridge, and which is also a quite popular subject in Imperial Garden. Those I mentioned before, the roofed bridge, right? Those large scale roofed bridge, and it worked better with the scale of Imperial Garden. If something like this was built in a private garden, it won't work. The private garden, that the so-called lake in the private garden would look no more than a bowl of water. So for the real size lakes and mountains, it need this kind of grand style architecture. And you might also notice the color difference. So here, the garden architecture are colorful, unlike the private garden, which is primarily black and white. But here, these kind of golden glazed tile and those green tile display brilliant color, and it work better with this kind of a real size mountain and real size lake. So getting closer to that central island and memorial archway, is located at the end of the bridge. So here we are standing somewhere here looking at that direction, right? So there's a bridge connecting the island with the east bank. and which is that bridge, right? So here, what seems a narrow, water body, in reality, it was still pretty big. So you can tell the scale, because a human figure would appear like something like that on that bridge, right? So it's a quite monumental in scale. And the Tibetan style pagoda on top of the hill of that island. And remind you, this is not the first pagoda. This is the on the right is the pagoda constructed in the Yuan dynasty, all right? During the Mongol dynasty in the 13th century. And here we have the later. This one is actually not built during the Qing dynasty. It was this area was adopted as the imperial park during the Ming dynasty. So the pagoda was constructed during the Ming dynasty. The Ming emperors, although they were not specifically Tibetan Buddhists, they also sponsored Tibetan Buddhism, and this, like the previous Mongol rulers and the later Manchu rulers, the Ming Chinese rulers were also kind of sponsoring a variety of religions, and including Tibetan Buddhism. Although they might claim a specific affiliation with a specific religion, like some Ming emperors were practicing Taoists. Some of them were more Buddhists, but they were open to all different religions. So I think this is a characteristic of the Eastern world. Those religious practices were not necessarily mutually exclusive. It is quite okay for the same imperial family practicing different religion. The earlier emperor might be a Buddhist, and then the later emperor might be a Taoist, but that is pretty okay. So now here, again, we are looking, we are in this is the North Sea, all right? And we are looking at the direction of the Forbidden City. That hill is the hill located to the north of the Forbidden City, built on top of the former Yuan royal sleeping chambers, right? So beyond that is the Forbidden City. Behind that, so we are looking at the direction of the Forbidden City from the Imperial Garden, and with that screening hill in the horizon. And so here we are kind of looking back, standing on this island, looking back at that roofed bridge, with 5 pavilions located along that bank. A small corner at the foot of the island, and so here, it's one of the small courtyard within the so-called North Sea Imperial Garden there. And this is the small private garden collected in the Imperial Garden. So this picture is inside that courtyard, inside that one, right? I mentioned that this is a copy of a private garden within the vast Imperial Garden, and this picture is taken inside that, and that is the lake of that, the central lake of that private garden, right? So I must say that if we apply the standard of private garden, those private garden collected in the Imperial Garden are not as consistent and as successful as those real private garden. I especially don't like, the use of imperial color in these small scale architecture, because here the nature is more subdued. You don't really get a sense of a real kind of a landscape. Of course, if you are an emperor who need to imagine a real landscape, you step out of the door, you are in front of the real landscape anyway. So I think, there was not a limit, and thus there's not a need to create that kind of imagination. So I think what I want to say is, take limitation as opportunity, right? So the emperor had limitless power. So there was no real drive to create that kind of imagined wilderness, because they had real actual landscape sites in their backyard. So if we use the standard of, appraising the private garden, I think these looks too much, too colorful, and architecture are too much in dominance compared to nature. That's just my opinion. So another shot inside that garden and the bridge. So obviously it is inspired by those small size literati garden, but it does shows more color. In comparison to the other part of the Imperial Garden, the colors are more tamed and humbler, but still there are much more color than the actual Jiangnan style literati garden. Pavilions elevated on top of a artificial hill. In this case, quite colorful again. So now let's move out of Beijing, right? So that's the city of Beijing there. And these are the so-called 3 hills and 5 gardens in the northwestern suburb of Beijing, where, the mountains meet the plain. So beyond that area, it was the endless kind of a mountain range in North China. So this area, it's ideal for the construction of gardens and parks, because it is located at the mountain foothill, the place where, the mountain springs feed the water, and which became rivers that provide those water sources for the garden. And it is also very accessible from the city, right? So that's an ideal location for the garden design. So there are the so-called 3 hills. And among those 3 hills, there are 5 major imperial gardens completed during the Qing dynasty. And those gardens include the Changchunyuan, which is here, the Yuanmingyuan, which is referred to this one, and the Qingyuan. Later it became known as Yihoyen, and that is the famous summer palace. This is right there. And oh, by the way, yeah, I think Changchunyuan is this one, and that is Jingyuan, and that is Jingmingyuan, right? So these are the 5 major gardens. So we are going to look at these 2. These 2 survived better. Yuanmingyuan survived primarily as a ruin garden, and the Qingyuan, or later known as the Yihoyen, survived better. Yuanmingyuan, in fact, it is sometimes also known as the 3 gardens of Yuanmingyuan because it has 3 separately enclosed quarters. So this is one, and this is another, and then this is a third. So it is a vast garden, and it is also a garden that collect, almost 100 private gardens within its vast lot. So the Yuanmingyuan Garden is also known as the Garden of Gardens. So from the plan, you can see there are many water bodies. So all those water bodies were not connected to form one large central water body. There are a few bigger water bodies like this one and that one, or those 2, bigger than others. But then, there are many small kind of water body. So see those dark area, those are all water bodies, right? So the reason for that kind of a fragmented look of Yuanmingyuan is because it was specifically planned to collect all those famous gardens in the world, in the known world, to the Manchu emperor in his backyard. So that is the, I think the characteristic of this Yuanmingyuan garden. Yuanmingyuan Garden was created during the Qing dynasty, right? So this is, it started in the 17th century, but mostly the majority of them were completed in the 18th century. So the idea is precisely to copy those gardens. 2 of the Manchu emperors, the Kangxi emperor of the late 17th and early 18th century, and the Qianlong emperor of the mid and the late 18th century, toured South China a couple times. And so on their journey to tour South China, they resided in those private gardens and the emperors were accompanied by court painters, and those court painters would, copy the design of those famous gardens in the south. And when they returned to Beijing, they would build one in their garden, right? So a lot of these gardens were inspired by those beautiful sceneries and beautiful gardens that the emperors had experienced. So that's the idea of Imperial Garden. So you have like 100 small garden within this large Imperial Garden. So each of those would be the size of a private garden, right? I talked about it's not only about China, because the Son of Heaven, the emperors of China would always claim that they were the ruler of the whole world. So there were actually also Western style garden. This area, the Qianlong Emperor built those Western style garden featuring geometric flower bed and Western style building. And it is characterized by strong axiality, a major east-west axis, and with some additional north-south axis. So that part is called the Western building within the vast Imperial Garden of Yuanmingyuan. Right? So the garden was magnificent, and there were numerous poetry and literature, depicting this Yuanmingyuan garden. However, it was destroyed during the Second Opium War. So these are the paintings showing the sceneries inside the Yuanmingyuan. It was destroyed during the Opium War in the 1860s, right? The Second Opium fought between China and the Franco-British allied army, and they invaded Beijing, and also there were a lot of kind of struggle, and eventually the garden was burned and looted. So there was some historical record about the burning of the Yuanmingyuan garden. We have a letter kind of written by a British soldier to his mother about the sad scene of the burning of the Yuanmingyuan garden. So anyway, all those, the most areas in the Yuanmingyuan garden were destroyed and burned. Today, when you go there, only the foundations survived. So today you go to that garden, go to the Yuanmingyuan Imperial Garden, you will see those large area of water surfaces, and then a lot of trees and a lot of stone platforms. So all those stone platforms survived. Those stone platforms survived the burning. All those wooden buildings are gone, except for that Western style part of the garden. So that part, the Western building corner, which was located in the northeastern corner of the vast garden, that part survived and survived better. I mean, not completely survived, but at least some columns are standing. And that became the iconic image of Yuanmingyuan Garden, which is quite ironic. So the Western powers destroyed the park, and the only part survived are the Western building. and all the rest of them are gone. So I'm showing you just one ruined part of the Western building section, right, in that area. And you can tell, just by looking at those few columns survived, you can tell it's not Chinese architecture, it's not Chinese style, it's European style. This is another building that was destroyed, and later, after the following centuries, the place basically became a quarry site. So the imperial power declined, and people take stone, those beautiful marble, beautiful stone from this site for the construction of those princely garden, or those private, went into those private collection. So when it was first burned by the French and British troops, most of them are still pretty complete and standing. But then, after another century, so they look like this. But still, you can see not only a specific Western style, but also a specific historical period associated with this architectural style, right? It's Baroque, right? So these are the Baroque architecture in Europe. They were built during the 18th century, and it is the period, when Baroque architecture was very popular in those European colonies in Asia and in Latin America. So the Manchu emperors had a Jesuit serving in their court. Those Jesuit priests from Italy, from France, they serve in the Chinese imperial court. And one of them, whose name is Giuseppe Castiglione, his Chinese name is Lang Shining, and he served the Emperor Qianlong, and he was one of the major designer of the Western building in the Ming-Qing Garden. So, and the design was in Baroque style, and you can tell that by the kind of rich profile of the arches and columns. This is the great fountain in the Yuanmingyuan. It's right there in that central location. It formed a north-south axis intersecting the east-west axis of that region. So it's a water fountain, and the water fountain, it's a Western style water fountain, and beyond that is another major building. So the Baroque style architectural detail, kind of featuring those swirling curves on the facade. And this is a close-up view of that, the fountain screen. So this is the building behind the great fountain, right? So those columns. And they used to belong to a full-size architecture, of course. So if you take my modern Chinese architecture class in the following fall semester, we will start from here to look at what happened after the history of Chinese architecture. And we will take a more detailed look at Yuanmingyuan. And we will start with the interaction between China and the outside world for the story of modern Chinese architecture, right? Now let's take a look at the I think I'm going to stop here, and we can pick up and look at our major focus for the Imperial Garden, which is that one. That is the Qing also better known as the Yihoyen today. And so we will pick up from here next Tuesday.